Hello, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. I wanted to take the discussion about the DFA market model a little bit further today. And to do that, what we're going to do is to look at some of the mortgage stress data within the model. Just to recap, this model is the core of the DFA analysis of the mortgage industry, and it draws data from our household surveys. It draws data from a number of other public sources as well as private data, and all of that information is processed within the model to produce a working assessment of the current mortgage market in Australia. And just to begin, let me show you the reconciliation that essentially we use to show that the model is working as expected. So on this particular chart, you can see that we have the owner-occupied total of mortgages outstanding and investment mortgages outstanding from the DFA model. So the total comes to 1.6 trillion. And then if you compare that with the latest RBA numbers, you can see that they are actually very close. The owner-occupied loans are at 99.3%, and the investment loans are reconciled at just over 101%. And totaling those up, we're at 99.96% of the total. So the model is working as expected, and is indeed reconciling quite nicely to the RBA numbers. We run that proof each time we run the model. So let's now go to the pivot tables. And here, what we have is the mortgaged households across Australia. And this time we've split them looking through a lens of mortgage stress. Now let's just do a few definitions first. So those households who are in stress are essentially split between severe stressed and stressed. So those who are stressed are making their mortgage repayments, but are doing so by cutting back on expenditure, putting more on credit cards, and generally hunkering down. Those in severe stress, on the other hand, are beyond that, and essentially are now struggling to make the repayments, or trying to refinance, or maybe even trying to sell their property. And if you look at the summary data, you can see that 77.1% of households are fine, so they're neither stressed nor severe stressed. And then we've got 22.2% of households who are in mortgage stress, and we've got 0.85% of households who are in severe stress. And it's worth just highlighting that income is actually not a very good proxy for stress. So if you look at the average income of households who are not in stress and compare it with those who are in severe stress or those who are in stressed, there isn't a huge amount of difference. And the average of all incomes, and this is gross household incomes, is 122,000. So now let's start drilling down into some of the data that we have available. So the first way we're going to look at this information is by state. So we can just drop the state view over the top. So this now gives us the same information as previously, but aligned to the various states. And it's worth highlighting, I think, that comparing those households who are not in stress across the different states, you'll see that NT is actually least stressed. And then we have a number of households in some states, particularly South Australia and Tasmania, and then Western Australia, who are more stressed. So stress varies by state. And then if we look at that in more detail, we can see it reported the other way. So we have in the ACT around 24% of households in stress, drops to 19% in New South Wales, 13% in the Northern Territories, 20% in Queensland, 26% in South Australia, 26% in Tasmania, 23% in Victoria, and 25% in Western Australia. And then if we look at severe stress, we see that in fact Victoria and New South Wales are the two states with the highest proportion of households in severe stress. WA is there too, at 0.4%. So stress varies by state and severe stress varies by state. Now another way we can look at the information is to look at it by our core household segments. And again, this is an average national picture. So what we can see here are our different household segments, and it's quite clear that young growing families and the battling urban and the disadvantaged fringe are the three household groups that stand out as being in the most difficulty. And if we drill into that in more detail, we can look at the stressed areas first. 32% of stressed households come from the disadvantaged fringe group, 28% from the battling urban group, and 27% from the young growing families group. If you then look at the severe stressed area, again you'll see some interesting changes. One of the most striking things is the high proportion of young affluents, more than 4%, who are in severe stress. Now, you can also notice that the exclusive professionals also register in the severe stress category. And in both cases, these are households who are relatively affluent in terms of the income they're receiving, but are also very heavily committed in terms of their mortgages and other expenditure. And so as a result, they don't have much in the way of discretionary spending left and are right up against it in making those mortgage repayments at the moment. And remember, mortgage rates are quite low at this time. Now, we can also look at it a different way. Let's take the segments away and look at it by property segment. So now we can see that first-time buyers are relatively stressed, but it's interesting to see that we've also got some holders and some who've refinanced relatively recently, and even those who are trading down, who are a little more stressed. Those trading up a little less so. And again, we can see that coming through. But let me highlight specifically that 3.6% of first-time buyers are in severe stress. And it's also worth highlighting their incomes are significantly lower than the average. Then we have those trading up with a higher income, but in some degree of stress. So again, it's interesting to see how this varies across the different segment groups. And we find that the segmentation by property behaviour is actually quite powerful. Another way to look at our data is by the DFA geographic bands. These are the geographic bands around the main urban centres. And we see that as we go out towards the suburbs, we do see some increase in degrees of stress. I'd also highlight, though, that looking at the severe stress group, 3.4% of those in the inner suburbs are in severe stress. So that's actually the highest by quite some way. Whereas those further out in the outer areas, although to some degree are in severe stress, it's a smaller proportion compared with the inner suburbs. It's also worth reflecting on this, that we've got in the regional and remote areas signs of stress as well. Now, there aren't a huge number of households necessarily affected, but the relative proportion is still quite high. So we've looked at it from a number of different angles. One last angle that's worth thinking about is we can, of course, also drill into regions as well. So, for example, let's take the Central Coast as an example of New South Wales. The Central Coast in New South Wales shows that we have 1.7% of households in severe stress. And it's worth noting that their incomes are relatively lower compared with the average, And the severe stressed households have a lower income compared to the mildly stressed households. So let's pick another one down the list. Let's go to Western Australia if we take a change there. So in Brand, what we find there is that the relative proportion of households in severe stress is pretty low, and their incomes are somewhat higher relative to the average. But we have a high proportion of households in mild stress, and they have lower incomes. So this is quite an interesting lens to be able to begin to understand some of the drivers towards stress. So to summarize, we've now explored some of the mortgage stress dimensions within the digital finance analytics market model. We've seen that some views give us quite good insights in terms of where the relative risk areas are. And some of those risk areas aren't necessarily in the households that you wouldn't automatically expect to be in difficulty. And some of those who are more affluent are also experiencing mortgage stress at these very low interest rates. Now, in our model, we're also able to estimate the forward-looking impact if rates would rise. But we're not going to discuss that today. That information is already available on the DFA blog. I'm Martin North, Principal of DFA. Thanks for watching.